Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are opening a file that, to be honest, a lot of people would probably prefer stayed closed.
Slight laugh. It's one way to put it.
We're looking at a specific chapter from our source material. It's titled In Defense of Paul. And this isn't just a light critique. I mean, this is basically a structural stress test of Western theology.
It really is. Yeah. We're looking at the foundational architecture of the faith, and the source is pointing out some very serious, very loud cracks in the foundation.
And usually when you hear about these cracks, the contradictions between what Jesus or Yeshua taught and what Paul taught, people tend to just wave them away.
Oh, yeah.
You hear, oh, you just need to read it in context, or it's a different dispensation.
Yeah.
But this source, it takes a much harder line. It argues these aren't just misunderstandings. They are, well, fundamental, irreconcilable clashes.
Exactly. And the premise here is that Paul has effectively become the linchpin of the religion. I mean, structurally speaking, the source argues that for the modern church, Paul is actually more important than Yeshua.
More important.
Yeah. If you lose Paul, the whole thing collapses.
Yeah.
So he must be defended at all costs.
And the how of that defense is what we're breaking down today. The source uses this phrase that I just can't get out of my head, mental gymnastics. It says, defenders of Paul have to be, and I'm quoting here, intellectually supple.
Which is a very polite way of saying you have to be willing to twist your logic into pretzels.
Circles, right.
The source describes it as a shell game. You have these contradictions places where Paul says one thing and Yeshua says the complete opposite. To handle that, defenders have a list of standard defenses.
The source lists 8 of them.
Yeah.
We're just focusing on the first 5 today.
Right, the big 5. And the trick, the real key, is the speed. You don't just stick to one defense, you switch between them.
So when one argument gets cornered,
If you instantly pivot to another one, even if it completely contradicts the argument you just made 5 seconds ago, it's fascinating to watch.
Okay, so let's watch this shell game in action. Let's start with defense number 1. The source calls this one the flawed apostle.
This is the most human defense. It's very common in academic circles or, among people trying to be realistic. The admission here is basically, okay, you got us. Paul wasn't perfect.
So they just concede the point. They admit he was wrong.
Partially. They'll admit he played fast and loose with the rules. The source highlights that Paul often compromised on Jewish law. Things like eating meat sacrificed to idols or how he interacted with pagan customs.
But the defense is that he had to do it.
Exactly. It's the classic ends justify the means argument.
This is where they pull out that, quote, I became all things to all men, right?
Precisely. To the Jews, I became a Jew. To the Greeks, a Greek. The argument is that the mission to the Gentiles was the single most important event in history. It was the key to saving the world.
So if Paul had to lie a little, or, pretend to be a Greek philosopher to get them in the door,
it was worth it. The mission justifies the method. Simple as that.
but the source just slams the brakes on this. It brings up a huge moral problem.
It does. It calls this situational morality. And the source makes a really, really compelling comparison to the actual biblical tradition. I mean, think about Daniel in the lion's den.
The classic Sunday school story.
Right. But look at the details. Why was he in the den? Because the king passed a law saying you couldn't pray to anyone but him. Daniel could have easily said, you know what? I'm a high-ranking official. I can do a lot of good if I stay alive. I'll close my windows and fake it.
But he didn't. He opened the windows. He made sure everyone saw him.
Correct. He risked death for a principle. He didn't compromise for the mission. The source also points to Joseph in Egypt.
With Potiphar's wife.
Yeah. When she tried to seduce him, he ran. Now, if he was using this Pauline defense, he could have rationalized it. He could have said, if I sleep with her, I stay in power, and I can save thousands of lives during the famine.
That's a really heavy point. That ends justify the means logic would actually condemn Joseph and Daniel for being too rigid.
Exactly. The source argues that in the Hebrew worldview, the worldview of Yeshua, the process matters just as much as the result. You don't sin to do good.
But there's a historical snag here, too, isn't there?
Yeah.
The whole flawed apostle argument relies on the idea that Paul was the only guy for the job.
That's the narrative we've all been sold. Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles. But the source points out a massive discrepancy in the New Testament itself. If you look at Acts chapter 15, verse 6, there's a council in Jerusalem.
The Jerusalem Council.
And it explicitly identifies Peter, not Paul, as the one chosen to speak to the Gentiles.
Wait, really? I always thought the breakdown was Peter to the Jews, Paul to the Gentiles.
That is how Paul frames it in his letter to the Galatians. But the source argues that was a self-appointment. Historically, the other apostles were already doing this work.
Like who?
Well, Thomas is traditionally associated with taking the message to India. You have early communities in Ethiopia, in Yemen.
So the Gentiles were being reached by the original followers of Yeshua without Paul's theology.
Yes. And specifically, without his anti-law stance. The source argues that the whole idea that you had to drop the Torah to win the Gentiles is just false, because the other apostles were doing it without that.
So the defense fails because A, the means are immoral, according to the text, and B, the end was already being achieved by other people.
Right. But the source goes one step further. It asks us to look at the results. This is the fruit argument.
And what were the results?
Well, the source gets pretty dark here, and it has to. It points to the history of the church that Paul built. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the pogroms.
The systematic oppression of Jewish people for nearly 2,000 years.
Exactly. The source asks, did Paul's compromised methods result in a peaceful evolution of monotheism? No. It resulted in a history of bloodshed that was often more violent than the pagan religions it replaced.
Okay, so imagine you're in a debate. You've cornered the defender on this flawed apostle thing. You've pointed out the moral failure, the bad history. What happens? Do they fold?
No. They flip the switch. This is where the mental gymnastics really start to shine.
Yeah.
They abandon the Paul was just a flawed man doing his best argument and pivot instantly.
The what?
To defense number 2, the infallible apostle.
Wow. Talk about whiplash. We go from he made mistakes to he is the voice of God in what, 2 seconds?
Exactly. And to make this work, they use a theological split the source calls the two Yeshuas.
Okay, break that down for us.
It's a workaround.
Yeah.
A way to resolve the fact that Paul contradicts Yeshua. The argument goes like this. There was the earthly Yeshua, the man who walked in Galilee, gave the Sermon on the Mount, taught the 12. That, they say, was for the Jews. It was for a specific time that is now over.
And the second one?
The ascended Yeshua, the cosmic figure who Paul claims met him on the road to Damascus. Paul claims he was taught by this ascended being for 3 years. The defenders argue that these teachings, the ones given to Paul, supersede the earthly ones.
That is incredibly convenient. It's basically saying, ignore the red letters in your Bible because that was the beta version. Paul is the software update.
In practice, yes. It effectively discards the Gospels in favor of the epistles. But the source points out this is basically theological suicide if you claim to follow the Bible. It cites Deuteronomy 18.
The prophet like Moses passage.
Yes. God promises to raise up a prophet and says, and I'm paraphrasing, I will hold accountable anyone who does not listen to my words that prophet speaks.
So if Yeshua is the Messiah, he is that prophet.
And if you ignore his earthly words to follow Paul, the source argues you are in direct violation of a command from God. You're literally ignoring the person you call Lord.
But there's a logic puzzle here, too.
Yeah.
If we accept this defense that Paul is infallible, we run into something called the Cretan paradox.
Oh, this is a great example. It just highlights the absurdity of the infallible claim. So in the book of Titus, chapter 1, verse 12, Paul is writing about the people of Crete. He quotes a Cretan prophet who says, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons.
Okay.
And then Paul adds, this testimony is true.
Wait a minute. I think
But the source's point isn't just to be clever. The point is it really God's eternal word that all people from the island of Crete are evil beasts? Or is that just Paul, the man, being prejudiced?
it seems pretty obvious when you put it that way. Plus, doesn't Paul himself admit he isn't always speaking for God?
He does. In 1 Corinthians 7.12, he explicitly writes, I, not the Lord, say this. So the text itself admits he isn't infallible.
So the infallible apostle defense just collapses under its own weight.
Yeah.
But the defender doesn't stop. They pivot again.
Exactly. This brings us to defense number 3 and 4, the covenant arguments.
This is replacement theology.
Right. The plan B theory. The argument is the Jews rejected Yeshua. They failed. So God got angry, put a veil over their eyes. That's a direct reference to 2 Corinthians 3.14, and decided to start a new religion with the Gentiles using Paul.
That veil concept is huge. You hear that all the time. Oh, the Jewish people just can't see the truth, yet they're blinded.
It's a dismissal tactic. But the source attacks the very premise of this rejection. It calls it a historical myth.
A myth. I thought the rejection of Jesus was the standard story.
Well, think about the actual history. Who followed Yeshua during his life?
Jews.
The crowds who were fed the loaves and fishes, the entire early church in Jerusalem, Jews now, who executed him.
The Romans, Gentiles.
So the source asks a devastating question. Why would God punish the Jews, the people who produced and followed the Messiah, and reward the Romans, the people who tortured and crucified him?
When you put it like that, the logic seems completely backward.
The source calls this thug logic. It references Martin Luther, the father of the Protestant Reformation. Luther famously argued that because the Jews were suffering in Europe, it proved God hated them.
So he used their suffering as proof.
This source compares this to a mugger beating someone up in an alley and shouting, "Look, God clearly hates you or he wouldn't let me do this."
Wow, that is visceral. You're manufacturing the proof of judgment by being the one judging.
Exactly. And the source argues that modern history puts the final nail in the coffin for replacement theology. For centuries, the proof was the wandering Jew, the idea that they were cursed to have no home.
And then 1948 happens.
The state of Israel is established. Against all odds, the Jewish people return. They survive. The source argues the existence of Israel is a massive theological problem for anyone relying on this. If they were replaced and cursed to vanish, they're doing a terrible job of it.
It kind of proves the old covenant isn't broken. So the veil and replacement arguments don't hold water. We're running out of defenses. What's left?
The argument from authority. Defense number 5. The ultimate Pharisee.
This is the one where they say, look, you can't question Paul's understanding of the law. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He knew better than you do.
It's the "I'm more Jewish than you" defense. But the source argues this relies on the audience having, well, zero clue what a Pharisee actually was in the first century.
We just think of them as the bad guys in the Gospels. But what were they really?
They were the anti-assimilation party. The word Pharisee comes from Perushim, meaning separated ones. Their entire platform was resisting Hellenization, resisting the pressure to become Greek.
And Paul?
Paul was a Roman citizen. From Tarsus, a Greek university city, he wrote in high-level Greek rhetoric. He quoted Greek playwrights. To a real first-century Pharisee, Paul wouldn't look like a super Pharisee.
What would he look like?
He would look like an apikoros.
Epikuros. Define that for us.
It comes from the name Epicurus, the Greek philosopher. In Jewish legal thought, an apikoros is a specific type of heretic. It's someone who knows the Jewish world but rejects the law in favor of a Greek worldview.
So Paul fits that profile perfectly.
According to the source, yes. So claiming he was the ultimate Pharisee is actually a way to delegitimize actual Judaism. It implies the rabbis who preserve the culture don't understand their own religion, but this Greek-speaking Roman citizen does.
So we've gone through 5 defenses. The flawed apostle, the infallible apostle, replacement theology, the veil, the ultimate Pharisee. And the source's main point isn't just that they're individually wrong, it's that they are mutually exclusive.
That is the absolute key. You cannot logically hold that Paul was a hasty, flawed man who made mistakes and God's infallible voice at the same time.
You can't say he was the apostle who ignores the law and the ultimate Pharisee who upholds the law.
They contradict. So why does it persist? If the logic is this broken, why hasn't the structure collapsed?
And the source has an answer for that too.
It does. It concludes with a fascinating psychological concept, the gnosis of contradiction.
Gnosis meaning secret knowledge.
Exactly. The source argues that for the leadership, the defenders of Paul, this ability to hold opposing views isn't seen as a logical failure. It's treated as a spiritual virtue.
A virtue. How?
Well, if you're confused by the contradictions, it's because you're a spiritual baby. You're still drinking milk, but the meat of the word, that's for the mature leaders who can handle the cognitive dissonance.
It creates an insider club.
It feels like a mystery religion. Only the special enlightened ones can understand how Paul can be both X and not X at the same time. The source argues this protects the ego of the interpreter. To admit it just doesn't make sense would be to dismantle their whole worldview.
So they turn the bug into a feature. The confusion becomes a sign of depth.
It's a powerful defense mechanism. It frames critical thinking as a lack of faith. And ultimately, it defends the linchpin. Because if you pull Paul out, that version of Western Christianity begins to unravel.
It leaves us with a really provocative challenge from the source. It's a question that I think every listener needs to sit with.
It's the ultimate question of allegiance, the source asks. If you follow a theology that explicitly overrides the literal teachings of Yeshua, the red letters, in favor of the teachings of Paul, can you truly claim to be a follower of Yeshua? Or does this elaborate system of mental gymnastics serve a different master? Does it serve the truth? Or does it simply serve to protect the structure and the ego of the believer who just cannot bear to face the contradiction?
That's a question that demands a deep dive of its own. We're going to leave it there for today. Thank you for wading into these turbulent waters with us.
Keep questioning.
See you next time.